It's my great pleasure to introduce Wendy LEEDS-HURWITZ. So she is emerit professor at the University of Wisconsin Parkside. She is the director of the Center of Intercultural Dialogue and professor invited at the CNAM. And thanks to Yves Wanquin, we're happy to have with us Wendy today, and she'll talk about how theory and method influence research. Wendy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back at ENS de Lyon. I haven't been here in a couple of years, but I remember it fondly. And we walked through the garden before we started, and I'm delighted to see that it has grown so much and everything is so green. So it's just lovely to be here. So what I'm going to talk about today is family socialization to cultural identity and how theory and method influence research. So I have a lot of the words I'm going to say on the PowerPoint for you as a backup. When I travel and give talks outside the US in English, I always make sure that I have a PowerPoint with a lot of the relevant words. So unlike when I give a talk on interaction in the US, where I might have a lot of photographs or videos or audio tapes, the goal is only to give you support to make sure that what I'm saying makes sense to you. So what I want you to do is that if I get to a word that you don't understand, or I'm not being sufficiently clear, or you just have a theoretical or methodological question, then just wave your hand and make me stop a minute, and I'll be happy to stop and give an explanation. We will have time for questions afterwards, and hopefully we'll have a lot of discussion. So let me get to it. So the outline of what I'm going to do, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the topics that are implicated in my talk, a little bit about my assumptions and theoretical orientation. We're going to do a very fast exercise, and I'm going to ask you to think for a minute without any idea of what kind of answer I might want. So anything you say is appropriate at that point. If you do anything that's totally off track at the end, then I'll know you didn't understand. But the first time around, you're allowed to say anything. I'll give you 2 case studies in some detail. I'll pull together all the pieces and talk about what I learned for each of the different approaches that I introduced. And then we'll go back to an exercise, and at that point, I want to know more from you about how your own experience fits with what I'm talking about. The advantage of socialization as a topic is that every adult in the world has been socialized to their own identity. And so it's never possible that I have somebody in the audience who has nothing to say about what I'm talking about. There will always be a connection. So the different topics that are involved in this study are all different research interests of my own. And one of the things that I do that is different from many other scholars is that I have very broad interests, and I tend to try to show the ways in which different approaches have things in common or can usefully be combined. And I know that this is not at all, especially in the US, especially in my own discipline of communication, not at all the standard. The standard is to pick a very narrow area and become the specialist on something very small. I do the exact opposite. I pick something very broad, and what's unique is that I'm usually the only person who combines those things in that way. And that also works, so it's very important to know that if you have interdisciplinary interests, by combining things other people do not combine, that is also unique. It's just a very different approach from in-depth, narrow specialization. So the things I'm going to combine are intercultural communication, by which I mean the study of how people from different cultural backgrounds interact, or the cross-cultural comparison of how people from different cultural backgrounds interact within their own culture. So it goes both directions. Really, we should save each term for one thing, and intercultural should be 2 people of a different cultural background interacting, and cross-cultural should be a comparison. In fact, many people put them all together under intercultural communication. That's the more common, at least in English. Language and social interaction is the current phrase being used for the study of what people do when they talk, when they move, looking at how they communicate through objects. So everything that in Europe is considered multimodal communication in an interpersonal, interactional context is what I'm talking about here. So looking at real people as they go about their lives. Social construction theory means that I'm always interested in the ways in which we make things with other people. I'm not so much interested in the physical world. I'm not interested, my training is not in biology or zoology or physics. I have no knowledge in those areas. But I'm always interested in how we socially, that is jointly, with other people, manage to make things like identity, things that are not very easy to put your hand on. It really would be much easier to study animals. You can put your hands on them and see them, and nobody questions that they're there. But what I study is interaction, and it's very important to me to study it with a social construction approach, because that is still not the standard in the US. And I think it's something that should be a standard. It's also not the standard in many parts of Europe, I know that. Semiotic theory is something I started looking at many years ago, and what I find it useful for is especially how people create symbols, things that stand for other things. And it's simply a way of looking at a theory that helps us explain how this works. And for me, this becomes very useful, especially in intercultural communication, understanding that symbols can be polysemic, that they can convey multiple meanings, either to the same person or to multiple people in an interaction. And that's hugely important. And semiotic theory is where I take the notion of polysemy from. And so I always draw that in as well. Many people in the US who do either semiotic theory or social construction theory don't understand the need to combine them. And for me, they are very complementary. It's very useful to put them together in this way. The ethnography of communication, for me, is primarily a methodological approach. There are people who argue that it is also theoretical. I think it's primarily method. And it's about studying real people in their real interactions, as opposed to just giving them surveys or interviewing them after the fact. I want to know what they're doing while they're doing it, because in my understanding, we don't always know how to talk about what we do. And so if you observe what people do, you gain additional knowledge. So those are all the things that I'm going to be pulling into here. So let me try, outlining your assumptions is always the single most difficult thing, but let me try to give you a few of my assumptions so that we are starting from the same point. One, to me, research is all about asking questions. It's figuring out what you want to know. That should always be the starting point. I think ideologically that's the starting point for everybody, but in practical terms, especially for students, that's not the starting point, and it must be. You have to start with a question about the way the world works, and then you move on. So if you start with the research question, your question should then determine your method. To me, this is the only obvious way to do it, but again, especially for students, it's always easy to start with the method because that's something you've been trained in. And you start with, what can I do with this method I now know? And then you invent a question you can answer with that method. That to me is really backwards. So I want to start with a question. And I don't want just any question. I want what are sometimes called genuine questions. That means a question I don't know the answer to. This is, again, to me, very obvious, but for many, many of my colleagues, especially in the US, but also many other places, it's easier to do research if you're pretty sure you know the answer. Well, of course it's easier. It's also very boring. I get bored very easily. I see no reason to go around asking research questions when I already am quite sure of the answer. So I always want to ask something when I have no idea what I'm going to get. I think it's much more fun. I think it's also much more useful in terms of the research. Now, why am I talking about cultural identity? That's the very large topic that is going to be what I'm going to discuss today. It's also what I often study. Cultural identity is a central topic in intercultural communication. It's right at the middle of what it is and how it works. If what you say intercultural communication is people from different cultural identities interacting, you must understand what it means to have different cultural identities and how these are shaped. So an identity means that you are somebody who shares symbols, which can be ideas, behaviors, words, objects, things, movements, and their meanings, very important, not just the idea but the meaning, not just the object but the use within a group. So your identity is the same as the other people who have the same ideas that you do and take the same things for granted, have the same meanings for the same things. Your culture, when people in intercultural communication started, when they used culture, they meant nationality. They very quickly figured out, as did anthropology, that nationality was really a fiction, and so you needed to look also at race and ethnicity and religion, and that there are, in fact, many cultural groups inside every country. I don't think there's any country that's completely homogeneous. There are some that are much more so than others, Japan being an example. It's more homogeneous than France or the US, as far as I know. And there have been more issues trying to cope with people who are more different. There's some interesting research, for example, on the children of American soldiers and Japanese natives. Their children have had a lot of problems, and the research was obviously done through the 80s and 90s because that's when there were children old enough to for people to notice that there were issues and start studying it. So if I'm going to study cultural identity, I'm going to study how members of cultural groups convey meanings both for themselves, because we have an idea of our own identity, and for others through the use of symbols. So that's going to be my starting point. How I convey information to me and to you about who I am and about what's important to me. A few more assumptions. Cultural identity is a social construction. It's something we make up. It's not a given. It's not a found object the way a tree is out there. I don't get to make the tree. I can perhaps shape it if I like bonsai. I can cut pieces off it. I can push it in certain directions. But it's a found object. I don't make the tree. But I make my cultural identity. Not by myself, with everybody else. I don't have complete freedom. I can't do whatever I want. I can't decide today I'm French. That would be ridiculous. It wouldn't work. But it's something that we make. There's something I'm doing that conveys my cultural identity. Children have to be socialized. If this is not a given, it's something learned. That means children learn their cultural identity. And that means researchers can study it very easily. Because if children have to learn it, then researchers can learn it as well. And so it's a fantastic research topic. And oddly, it's one that is not studied very often. When I publish the book that I'll be taking the case studies from, it's called From Generation to Generation, Maintaining Cultural Identity Over Time, and you'll get a slide with that. People thought it was a truly bizarre topic. There was not one other person studying intercultural communication in the US who was studying childhood socialization. This was nothing they thought was obvious. which to me is bizarre. It's a fantastic topic to study. It's a very easy thing to study if you go about it the right way. It's also a good thing to study in terms of discussion of research method, because there are many ways of studying it that don't work. So the large research question for me is, what are all the ways in which members of different groups socialize their children to cultural identity? And I hadn't actually thought about this very much until I was having a conversation with a colleague who is Chinese. He's from Hong Kong. His wife is from mainland China. He lives in the US. And we were talking about our children. My son had to learn, he learned English because he was living in the US, but he also had to learn Hebrew because of being Jewish. And American Jews teach their children Hebrew from about the ages of 7 until 13, when my son had to have a bar mitzvah, stand up in front of a group of people, demonstrate that he could speak some Hebrew, and then he was done. The rest of his life he doesn't have to speak any Hebrew anymore. That's it. And my colleagues' children had to know Cantonese for his side of the family, Mandarin for his wife's side of the family. They started learning from the time they were born, and they were working on complete fluency. My son only had to read. His children had to speak and read and write and listen. They had to become completely fluent, and they were expected to continue with their studies until they left home, which at the very earliest would be 18 and might be later. And we had this conversation, and we thought, that's interesting. Why is nobody studying this? And that's where this book came from a dinner with a colleague, and we had this conversation. This is how books appear. This is why I like genuine questions. You start with a question you don't know the answer to. Look at the variety. I wonder what else other people do. At that same conference, I went to a panel where somebody was presenting. He was Korean, and he talked about a martial art as the most important form of cultural identity if you were Korean. And I said, martial art? That doesn't make sense to me. Why would a martial art be my form of identity display? How strange. And that's between those two events, the dinner one night and serving as respondent on a panel the next day. I said, okay, we need a book to talk about the variety. It's time to get moving. Now, your exercise is to very quickly, without knowing anything more, what are some of the ways in which your own parents socialized you to your own cultural identity? You get one quick answer. So we had language and martial arts as the two first examples. I want to hear, and remember, you get to draw upon nationality, you get to draw upon ethnicity, race, and religion. Any of those, nationality, ethnicity, race, religion. What did your parents do to tell you who you were in any of those ways while you were growing up? Quick answers. Okay, I have a hand over here.
I'm afraid it's going to be exactly the same example that you've just given.
Okay.
Okay, so being of the same faith as you are, it was going to what's called cheder, which is a Jewish
Day school.
On a Sunday, eating food that corresponded to religious tradition. Because I wouldn't say religion, because it was culture rather than religion. Because
Yes.
not coming from a religious family as such. Learning to read in Hebrew but not being able to understand it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, Judaism is uncommon in that, depending on the context, it is often considered an ethnicity as well as a religion. And of course, the Nazis thought it was a race as well. So it gets treated quite differently. And I've used this quite often as an example with my students for how it is socially constructed, because otherwise it wouldn't work the same way. Okay, other quick answers? Something obvious? Morgan?
Well, I'm half French, half Russian, so my mom decided to, first when she came in France, decided to speak to me in French because she was learning French with my her environment, and then she decided to, when she learned enough French, she decided to switch into Russian to me. But the thing is that while she switched, I didn't understand why she did the switching of language.
How old were you when she switched?
I was 3,
Oh,
and
yeah.
I didn't understand why we were the only one talking in Russian together while the rest of the people couldn't understand it. But I think I've realized my cultural identity with cartoons because I was small, and she tried to create this environment, this Russian environment around me, reading books and watching TV and talking to me.
Okay, thank you. One more answer. Somebody else who thinks there's some obvious? Yes.
Okay, I'm French and Japanese, and my father is French, my mother is Japanese. And she always talked to me in Japanese, so I guess for me it's really weird to hear them when she talks in French. But then at home, I don't know, she read me some Japanese books. That's about it, I think.
Okay, those are very appropriate answers already. Everybody else has to answer at the end, when you will be able to think about the examples I've given and talk a little bit more about your own lives there, okay? All right, let's go back on with it. After the large research question, and these questions come straight out of the introduction to the book that you already read, the one that I'm going to focus on today is how is cultural identity socially constructed within families. The main place where socialization to cultural identity occurs is within the family. There are a couple of other questions that I posed to the authors in that book, the authors of the different chapters. One was, what are the critical moments in conveying cultural identity to the next generation? Because it does not seem to happen equally every day. There are particular points when it becomes very important, and that's interesting because they're at different times of life for different groups. Another one would be, what are the practical difficulties in managing bicultural or multicultural identities? And we had a couple of examples of that within the book, especially a colleague who is Japanese American. Her grandparents were from Japan. She grew up in Hawaii. And her husband is from Benin. And so it's a very unusual combination. And she talks a lot. And he actually spent a lot of time in France growing up, because if you are wealthy and you're in Benin, what you do is you go to France for vacations. And so she talks a lot about that combination. And that's an interesting example. And then what elements of identity have meaning for different groups? Everybody doesn't use anything the same way. Most groups use language as something very important. Many groups use objects, rituals. There are different things. And as I said, apparently if you're Korean, Taekwondo becomes very important. And so it's not the same, and that's a really hard thing to get accustomed to. The thing that seems important to you is not the thing. I mean, martial arts to me is really low down on the list. It really shocked me. It was not what I expected. It had nothing in common with my upbringing. And so that's an important question. Which are the various modes by which people convey identity? But we're going to focus on the first one. How is it socially constructed? Now, what are the implications of this question for research methods? We're going to focus on how is identity socially constructed in families. Okay, socialization, to me, primary socialization, you must look at families, because that's where it occurs. There is something called secondary socialization, which is what happens when the children leave the house and go to school, play in the neighborhood. And there's much later socialization. When you became a student at ENS Lyon, there was socialization there as well. You had to learn certain things that were going to make it possible to be a competent student here. When you leave the university and get a job, there is socialization to the workplace. Every time you change jobs, there's a new socialization to a new organization, which has a slightly different organizational culture. But if we're going to look at primary socialization, we look at families. Family activities are private by definition. That's the whole point. What happens in my family is not out there in the public eye. Therefore, you would think that would be extraordinarily difficult to study. I can't walk into your family and have things go on the way they would normally go on and do a competent ethnography very easily. It would take a very long time for me to be accepted. So once I decided this was my question, I had to think very hard about the method I was going to use. And what I did was to invite intercultural communication scholars who I knew from many different backgrounds to document their own families. What is it that their parents did for them, and what is it that they did for their children? In a couple of cases, they had no children. Tibetan Buddhist monks don't have children. And so the Tibetan Buddhist monk talked about his nieces and nephews. The Tibetan Buddhist monk has a PhD in communication now, but he doesn't have children. So it's very uncommon. It's a long story. Anyway, so mostly it's 3 generations, and in a few cases it's 3 generations of nieces and nephews. People who I wanted to include for various reasons in the book, but who didn't have children to talk about. I asked them to describe what was actually occurring. I also asked them to consider the historical context. I wanted much larger context for the group, the extent to which their experience was typical or atypical for their group should be part of the chapter, and so it is. So it's not, there's a term in the US, autoethnography, which means doing ethnography of yourself. I don't usually use that term because when it is done in the US, it is typically done without any context whatsoever. And I don't see the point in that. I don't just want a document of what happened in my family, period, with no consideration for the rest, because I don't think that's terribly useful. So I didn't use that term in the book. It is a very common term now in the US. I have had other people tell me that my book was autoethnography, so if you hear that term, it's maybe that. But certainly ethnography as the method, that is documenting what really occurred by the participants. Now, ethnography always includes what's called participant observation. That means you must be there. The primary method in ethnography is always participating and observing and documenting. One of my professors, Ray Birdwhistle, very well known for establishing the study of kinesics, what people do with their bodies that's communicative, always said we had 2 heads if we were going to be ethnographers. We had to learn to have 2 heads. One head is the participant, one head is the observer. And you have to keep moving between these as the interaction occurs. Now, of course, it was a little different when I asked people to document their own history because the observation isn't occurring at the same moment. It's something that is usually complete. But with their children, they usually documented what was occurring contemporaneously. So they did more of the thinking about what had happened and then documenting what did. But we also used things like objects as a way of making sure that we were linked to something that was obvious. We did a lot of different techniques, which I'll talk about a little bit. Ethnography always includes a lot of different techniques. One of my colleagues in anthropology was an economic anthropologist. I've had a lot of colleagues in communication who think that ethnography is qualitative and not quantitative. Ethnography often includes quantitative elements as part of what it does. Ethnography is very large and can include many, many things. Ethnography is particularly appropriate as a method when people are making implicit choices. That is, when they don't stop and put it in words for themselves, and therefore it's harder to tell you what they've done. And so ethnography is very useful when you want to talk about things that are implicit, because people aren't always as good at describing what they're doing. So ethnography normally requires at least 3 very different steps: participation, being part of what's happening, you always have what's called a naturally occurring group. So this is a naturally occurring group. You are here. I didn't call you here so I could talk to you. There's a core here of a group that already meets and a few strays that periodically show up, and then a guest lecturer. So this is not something brought together for an experiment. It's not people I grabbed out of the hallway. That would not be a naturally occurring group. Bona fide means a legitimate group, one that has its own existence, whether or not the researcher is present. There's always observation and documentation, so usually this takes the form, depending on the study, any and all of these. Field notes, meaning you write down, these days type, used to be with a pen, nobody does that anymore, what you noticed, and videotaping, much more so now than ever used to be, audio taping quite often, photographs all the time, and interviews. To get the other person's perspective of what happened, you ask them questions. These are not usually questionnaires where you start out with a list of questions ahead of time, so much as showing them your data and saying, look at what happened in this video, I don't understand this, can you explain it to me? So that kind of interview, it's a very different kind. Analysis means placing into context and generalizing from the particular. So I'm not so much interested in what all of my colleagues were doing in their families as using that as a beginning point for what is typical in that group. And then a cross-cultural comparison. The step of comparing different groups in ethnography is called ethnology, and really anthropologists invented both terms. Ethnography was the description, and then ethnology was the comparison of descriptions across groups. And the goal of ethnology was originally to find universals. People are a little less concerned about that now than they were 100 years ago when they started doing it. Ethnology has also been used as a term to describe ethnography. So the terms are used interchangeably by many people. I always find it easier to come up with one clear explanation for a term and then use it consistently. But both terms are used in many contexts interchangeably. So in this book, and in the case studies that you're going to hear about, there were field notes, there were audio tapes, videotapes, photographs, microethnography, which I'm going to explain, conversation analysis, which I'm assuming you probably know a lot about, but I'll take a minute to make sure, and some historical analysis. These are the same methods that researchers normally use on other people, but they turned them back on their own families for this project. Now, the first case study focuses on material culture. Material culture is a term referring to anything that has physical existence. The tables and chairs are material culture. Food that we just had at lunch is material culture. Clothing that we're wearing now, everybody has clothes on, that's material culture. So things that you can put your hand on that have physical existence together are quite often called material culture. It's a very useful term. Now, the problem is that identity is intangible. It's fuzzy. I tried to show you very fuzzy borders here. How do you put your hands on identity? That's a difficult thing. One answer is to go look at material culture because it's very tangible. Notice now tangible has very hard borders. It's a concrete, visible thing you put your hands on. So by focusing on material culture and the fact that the objects in my home are not the same as the objects in yours, the clothing I'm wearing may not be the same, the food I eat may not be the same. These are all elements that are very easy to focus on when you look at identity. So material culture is a way to make identity visible, and studying a set of objects, a set of things that are material, accumulated over time, especially across generations, especially within generations of the same family, gives you a lot of information about identity in that family. Rituals are one of the places where you use material culture. So a ritual might be a coming of age celebration, a birthday party, it might be a wedding, it might be a retirement party, it can be many things. A ritual is an event. A ritual uses language and material culture, typically. And so notice, objects end up with stories. Language is not left out when you look at material culture, but it provides a focus for the language. Looking at the story that goes with the object is quite often a very easy thing to do. And the stories don't change because the researcher asked the question. So material culture gives you a focus, and then you can add language because you look at the stories that go with the material culture. All right, the chapter I'm going to talk about is the one that I wrote about myself and my family called Be a Mensch. Mensch is a Yiddish word. Literally it means man. It's used to mean male or female, human. And Menschlichkeit is the quality of being a good person, not just being human, but being the kind of person we would look up to.
German.
It's Yiddish. It's Yiddish comes from German.
Yeah.
So in German it just means Mensch. It just means person, man. But in Yiddish it means a good person. In German it doesn't. Very big difference there in the languages. So Menschlichkeit is the adjective form, and it means all the good characteristics you would want. There is a meme floating around the internet right now that a colleague sent me, and it says, using the American presidential election as a Yiddish exercise, and it says Mensch, and it has a picture of Bernie Sanders. And it says Putz, and it has a picture of somebody who shall remain nameless. Trump. Donald Trump is not known as a good person, and Bernie Sanders is known as somebody who is honest and serious and considerate of others, those sorts of qualities. So things you would want in your child. So be a mensch is what parents say to children all the time. And it doesn't matter if you're a girl. I grew up in a family of 3 girls. Be a mensch means be a good person. Be a person I will be proud of. Okay. So I'm going to focus on a little piece from that chapter, just the pictures of menorahs that go with Hanukkah. So the ritual I'm going to be talking about, Hanukkah, is a historical event that in Israel was very minor, is very minor, in the US is very major, has become hugely important only because American Jews needed to counteract Christmas. The most important religious holiday in the US is Christmas, which you only celebrate if you're Christian. So if you have Jewish kids and they're in school with Christian kids, the Christian kids get presents. And they spend months making a fuss about Christmas. And so American Jews about 50 years ago decided to turn a holiday that was not very important but that happened at the right time of year into an important holiday in the cultural group. Even though it's a religious holiday, it's a very small religious holiday. So presents now are given over 8 days instead of 1 the way you do for Christmas. And that's always, of course, a good thing if you're a kid to get presents for 8 days. That's wonderful. Many families divide it by giving 7 small presents and then 1 big one. Wealthier families give 8 big presents, and then you get to lord it over the Christian kids who only got 1 big present, that sort of thing. There are many objects. There are 2 in particular that are very important. A menorah is a candelabra. It's a holder of candles. And a dreidel is a top. Dreidels don't become important. The story told always is the actual historic event. It has to do with a time 2,000 years ago when the Romans were in Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. And there was something called the eternal light. And the problem was, how do you keep the light going when all the oil has been destroyed? They discovered a very small cache of oil and kept it burning for the 8 nights that it took to make more oil from olives. So that's the basic storyline. So you always light candles for Hanukkah, and you light candles every night for 8 nights. So looking at the menorah that a family has is very important. And when I started writing this chapter, I went to the shelf where I have the menorah and realized I had a lot of menorahs. And I started looking at all the menorahs, and I decided this was a wonderful focus. So I'm going to talk about them very briefly. So this particular one, my mother was an artist. Now, a menorah always has two pieces. This is where the shamash, the candle that receives the light from the match, goes. And then you use the shamash to light the candles that are put into all the other 8 spots. So there's actually 9 spots in a menorah. 1 for 1 candle that lights the others, and then 8 holes for 8 more candles. Now, it's hard to tell if you're not used to menorahs, but if you think about it, there's a candle standing here, and the flame is here. What happens? This is made of clay. After a decade of use, this is starting to crack, and so we don't use it anymore. My mother made this in the early 1950s when she started having children, and then she decided it was going to break. It was time to move on. So it wasn't terribly functional. It is beautiful when it's lit, but we don't actually light it now because we're afraid of breaking it. So this is the one that she and my father now, he was not a craftsman, but she wasn't used to working in wood, so she made him help. This is a completely different menorah, different design. This is a piece of wood, little brass nails, and these are actually brass washers that he glued on. So he's the one who hammered the nails in to make a Jewish star. And the shamash goes in the middle, and you have 4 candles on each side. And you always light them in order. So the first night you light 1, the second night you light 2, until the 8th night you light all of them. So this was our menorah in the 1960s, and we have all sorts of stories that go with that. This was the menorah my mother handed me when I went to college in 1971. This is tiny. It's about 3 inches big. This is the menorah that she had in Germany, and it was used as a way of hiding Jewish identity from the Nazis because it wasn't exactly something you wanted to advertise, and so they started making very, very, very discreet little menorahs that you could put away and it wouldn't be visible. And this was quite deliberately done. When I went to college, she said, you know, I'm not sure you want to make a big thing of your identity, but if you want to light candles on Hanukkah, and Hanukkah happens while you're still in college, take this one. So I took it to college with me. So it's completely different from the others. It's not about a big family display, it's about being able to still celebrate. This one is very old. It comes from my husband's family. It was bought by my husband's grandparents and then given to him by his grandparents. It takes oil. Now, if you know anything historically about Israel, this is the shape of a lamp that is 2,000 years old. This is a Roman lamp used all over. You could buy them in Israel. My parents bought one. They have it. It's about this big. This is oil in the pitcher, and you pour oil into each of the little tiny lamps. And the one in the middle is the shamash. We don't know the exact year, but we think it came from the 40s. It might be a little earlier. This is the one my husband and I bought when we were graduate students in Philadelphia in the 1970s. We bought it in 1976. It's brass. It's very, very cheap. And you notice it actually says Hanukkah across the top, which for a prior generation would have been completely bizarre. You don't need the name of the holiday there. Of course you know what this is. Why would you write it on there? So to me it's fascinating looking back at it. We didn't think twice about buying this one. This was one that was available in a synagogue gift shop for very cheap. It's fairly small. It's about this big. And it still takes birthday cake candles the way my little tiny one in college did. So that's the one we used for a few years. And then we had a son, and we needed a bigger, more interesting one. And the other 2 that my parents made were still at my parents' house. I have them now, but I didn't have them at the time. And so we bought this one. This is handmade by a ceramist. Very uncommon design. The shamash is the middle, and you put much larger candles. This is quite large. It's about, 15, 20 centimeters across and fairly tall. This one we used through the 1980s and 1990s while our son was growing up. And this is the one that we still No, we didn't. We gave it away. We had to buy a new one this year. I forgot that. Never mind. After we moved, it's a long story. We gave it away by mistake. This one is the reason I'm showing you the sequence. When I looked at what was on the shelf, I said to my husband, so tell me about this one. He said, don't be ridiculous. That's from your family. I said, oh no. My family is the one that was in the antiques business. I know the objects in my family. This is not from my family. This is from your family. He said, I have no idea what this is. I've never seen it before. By the time I was writing the chapter, his parents had both died. I couldn't ask. But the only thing we can figure out is that it's quite old. I looked it up. It goes back at least to the 20s, probably earlier. It's from Israel, quite obviously, or at least somewhere in the Middle East. It takes oil. It's very difficult to impossible to use. These are little tiny cups. They're not the lamps of the other one. They're very difficult to use. You put a little tiny wick in there. It's very hard. We've never used it beyond the first time when we tried and we decided it wasn't worth the effort. But the fascinating thing for me is to realize this has been on my shelf for a decade before it occurred to me to question, how did we get this? Where did this come from? And why do we have it? We kept this, by the way. Now, isn't that funny? When we moved and downsized, we kept this because we figured it's an important piece of family history. But we don't know what it is, where it came from, who brought it. Interesting. Okay, so what does this tell me? In terms of content, material culture is a very typical way to convey cultural identity, a very easy thing to study because the objects are visible, they convey identity. Nobody has a menorah whose house I have ever been in if they're not Jewish. This is not considered a collectible by any other group. So it's a very clear statement of identity. And they're very visible usually, especially if it's anywhere near Hanukkah time. And Hanukkah moves, November, December, more or less, most of the years. Group members always have stories. I have never met anybody who I couldn't ask the story of their menorah. And usually you get a long story. Where did this come from? Who gave it to you when? What decade? They know that. But notice that very different objects become important at different stages in your life. The menorah that was relevant in Nazi Germany is not the menorah that is relevant when I'm raising a child in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 50 years later. And so objects, having one object does not always do it. You may need multiple objects for the same function at different locations and decades. That's interesting. And objects then come to have a lot of significance for children because they learn about them. This is part of how we are socializing children. Part of how I knew I was growing up Jewish is that I celebrated Hanukkah and I had to have a menorah to celebrate Hanukkah. That's the center of it. But in terms of method, there's something completely different to learn. Assuming that you know what you say and do, or even assuming that you know why there are certain objects in your home, turns out to be wrong, even for the researcher. That really surprised me. Ray Birdwhistle's list, when he taught us about ethnography, one of the few people who very formally taught me how to do ethnography was Birdwhistle, who was trained as an anthropologist. What we do is one thing. What we think we do is another thing. And what we are willing to say we do is another thing again. That's important. So you need to document even your own behavior, which you think you know, because sometimes you don't. It never occurred to me that I have objects in my house. This is one of the few. I really do know most of the objects in my own home very well, where they came from, who gave them to us when. But I have a few objects like this that I don't know where they came from or why I have them. It's fascinating. I know what this is. It's a menorah, but I don't know where we got it. All right, completely different case study, a different chapter in the book. This one I'm going to focus on verbal versus nonverbal behaviors. Again, in rituals. Rituals ended up a very heavy focus in the book because they are so easy to study and to focus on as you try to talk about a particular identity. The problem here is that much behavior is very minor. So I wrote the word minor very small for you. It's hard to even notice. And this is especially true for nonverbal behavior. Most of us are not good at describing what we do nonverbally. We don't notice it, we don't study it, we don't think about it, we can't talk about it. And the phrase Birdwhistle always used when he was inventing kinesics was out of awareness. It is not something that we have to attend to. And he always explained it because if we did have to attend to it, we wouldn't have time for anything else. If we had to think about how to breathe, forget doing anything else with your life, you would be busy keeping the body breathing. So it's like that. That was always his example. Makes sense. So the solution is called microethnography. It's a very specific thing. Curtis LeBaron is one of the people who does it, and he wrote this chapter for me called Cultural Identity Among Mormons, a microethnographic study of family home evening. So he studied one ritual. He is Mormon. And you have to understand that this was one of the most difficult chapters for the author to write. Mormons do not tell anybody what they do. The religion is secretive beyond anything. His wife is also Mormon. They were both raised Mormon. There are secrets between them because women are not allowed to fully participate in the religion. This is one reason I would never be Mormon. I would not be happy. But his wife seems to be happy. That's okay. It's up to her. There are levels within Mormonism. There are literally levels in the Mormon Church, and you rise to a new level and you learn new secrets. And women are only allowed in some parts of the religion. And so for him to write about what his family did was very difficult. And I said, no, I really think it would be an interesting chapter. I want you to try it. And he wrote it, and I sent it back, and I said, try again. Oh, yeah, this doesn't work. I did the same thing with the Tibetan Buddhist monk. I sent it back and I said, you're telling me the history of the group. I need to know about your family. Where's your family in here? So for certain groups, it's very easy to talk about what they do. They're used to making it public. And for other groups, this is very difficult. What he ended up doing, however, is fantastic. So he's writing about something the Mormons call family home evening. This is very rare for religious groups to have a very specific time period. One evening every week must be dedicated to teaching the children the religion. At home, this is not with a religious specialist. It's not like going to church. You still have to go to church. But one evening, everybody who's Mormon stays home and teaches the next generation. And children are very important. He has 5 children, I think. I have 1. So this is, in the US, 5 is very uncommon. It's more likely a prior generation would have been Catholic. This generation, Mormon, is more typical to have that many children in the family. They use objects, songs, texts, stories, and games to convey the religious belief. So it's not just talking at, lecturing at the children. You do things. So now what is microethnography? Microethnography is a way of documenting words or behaviors that might be missed. There were other terms for this previously, but that's the term being used currently. Basically, you videotape typical normal interaction, and then you transcribe pieces of it, and you include not just the words, but the nonverbal behaviors as well. Specifically, you almost always would be including proxemic, which is use of space, and kinesic, which is use of the body behaviors. This is completely obvious to people in Europe who are using multimodal communication, but it is still not that common in the US, so it's very important. And it's something that's still remarkably uncommon, which is a pity. The transcription then serves as the basis for analysis, not the original tape. The assumption is it's got too much, so you transcribe the parts you want to focus on, and then you work with the transcription. This is an object that Curtis's mother made for the family or bought at a fair for Mormons. I don't remember the full story. I actually think it might be in the chapter. And if you can read it, this is a really lousy image because I took a screenshot from the book. I didn't have the original photo with me to make that So I'm sorry about that. The original photo went to the publisher and it's long gone, but I think you can sort of read it anyway. But I wanted it big enough so you could see. Notice these are the parts of what happens. There's prayer, song, lesson, game, prayer, and treat. And then these are the names. And at the time he wrote this, there were 4 children. There are now 5. And so mom and dad, and then the 4 children in the middle. And notice that these are little name tags that move across the pegs so that the children learn because they do different parts every time they do this. Okay? So now this is his table, and again, I just took a quick screenshot of what is in the book. It's not the most legible when it's large. I'm sorry about that. But what's interesting to me, if you look at this chart, these are the parts of what gets done at family home family home evening is the only place all of them get done. So you have a song and a prayer and the lesson and another song and another prayer and a game and some sort of treat. Then there are different types of activities that you engage in if you're Mormon, depending on which part of the community. So everybody goes to a sacrament meeting and you have those things. Everybody goes to Sunday school and you only have those. The priesthood meeting is only for men and you have those things. The relief society is only for women. You have the same things, but separately in this case. The primary school is for children and you do all of them, and youth night is teenagers and you do a few. So what's happening is they have very carefully, Mormonism is a more recent religion than most, and so it's very explicitly and carefully designed. And so family home evening is designed as the way to teach the children everything they will need to know in all of the religious activities, which is fascinating. This is an excerpt from his transcript. I'm giving you just a few lines again. I think I should really retype that rather than using the screenshot. I'm sorry. When I look at mine, it looks fine, but when it's big enough to go up there, it's illegible. So the italics is his description of what's happening non-verbally, and then the non-italic is the words. So the father, that's him, is sitting. He turns his head to look at the family home evening chart, this little thing with the pegs that I showed you. His daughter Aubrey looks at him, and his head is turned. That's what you see on the videotape. She says, "Who's the song?" Then another child looks at the chart, stands up, walks to it. The other 2 children look at the chart, and he says, "It's Matt." And then they all turn away from the chart and look at each other. This is what he spends the whole chapter analyzing after he gives all the background that we've already done. First of all, this is a completely incomprehensible question. In English, "Who's the song?" makes no sense. That could be used in a grammar class of "you cannot say this," right? But of course, interaction is much more interesting than just grammar classes, and she really did say this, and it really made sense in context. "Who is the song?" tells her father that she looks at him and sees him looking at the chart. She knows what the chart says because it's too far away, it's across the room, she can't read it. She knows that family home evening always starts with a song, and she understands that what happens with the chart is that it assigns activity to children or to participants because the parents get some activities as well. She doesn't say anything about the chart. She just says, "Who's the song?" She doesn't say, "What does our pegboard tell us?" She looks at the father. The other children then look at the chart, showing that they understand what it does, and they understand that family home evening is very carefully organized, and it unfolds in a reasonable fashion. And he gets all of this out of one exchange. Who's the song? It's Matt. Okay, I'm not going to do more with that. That's the quick. I know I'm running out of time here. Good grief. So in terms of content, through the talk and the gaze and understanding of otherwise meaningless words, the children show their acculturation to family home evening and thus their understanding of their Mormon cultural identity. Family home evening serves as the nexus of 2 communities of practice, home and church. Parents use the home as a location within which to socialize the children to what will happen in the religious activities. Okay, in terms of method, microethnography demonstrated how even very minor behaviors such as who is looking at where and the exact words chosen for a question, the fit between the words and the use of eye gaze, can be used to illustrate larger points, in this case how children are socialized to cultural identity. So we use micro behaviors to illustrate macro issues. So let's go back to the original research question. What are the ways in which different groups socialize their children to cultural identity? So we ended up with a smaller question we were going to focus on. How is cultural identity socially constructed within families? These two case studies document how family rituals and the accompanying objects, together with learning stories and ways of acting appropriate to the context, show you these families socializing their children to their particular cultural identity. Other chapters in the book, I can make this available to Christine and she can pass it around to everybody else. Then you don't have to try to write quite so much or take pictures. Other chapters in the book document other ways of socially constructed cultural identity and socializing children to those identities within their families. Okay, overall conclusions with both of these case studies. And I'm going to do a quick run through each of the topics that I introduced as my interests. Because to me, the question is not just did I answer my research question, but what did I learn about each of the topics that drives my research. So in terms of intercultural communication, cultural identity is a key topic. We should be spending far more time just on cultural identity, which I have ended up focusing on right now. I taught a course last summer and I'll teach a course this summer to graduate students in Canada, and the course is called Cultural Identity, because that seems to be a very hot button issue, especially right at the moment. And so it's the thing that we're focusing on. We're actually going to be using immigration as our case study, but I can talk about that more afterwards. You can study intracultural, cross-cultural, or intercultural examples. In this case, we were studying intracultural examples, and then, because you have all of them in the same book, you end up with a cross-cultural comparison. In this book, I did not look at people from different cultural groups interacting together. I've done that elsewhere in other books. It's definitely worth studying how children are socialized to cultural identity. I wish more people studied it. That book came out a long time ago, and there's still, came out at least a decade ago. I don't remember what year that was published, whatever
2006.
it was. 2006. Okay, so 10 years ago. It's still, there are a couple of books on the topic. There's some articles, but there's much less than there really ought to be. It's definitely worth studying rituals. Again, a topic that is hardly touched within intercultural communication, and it seems to me a topic that should be a focus. Especially when you look at rituals that combine different cultural groups, so that I did a book on intercultural weddings. And it's a completely different research question. How do you display cultural identity in a ritual when you have to display competing identities simultaneously? How do you do that? That's a great question. That was another genuine question. I did not know the answer when I started. And a minor point that isn't obvious in what I talked about today, but is obvious in the chapters, when a family has more cultural identities than can easily be managed, some of them start dropping out. So that my father's family was Romanian, and that has completely dropped out by my generation. He knew almost nothing about being Romanian. That was not something that got passed on, and so very little got passed on to me. In terms of language and social interaction, clearly face-to-face interaction should be a central context in intercultural communication. In the US at least, it is not. So I think it should be. There's an argument here for why you need to look at real people interacting face-to-face. There's a lot of focus on media, there's a lot of focus on international relations, which often is much more political, and there's a lot of focus on cross-cultural comparison. There's much less focus on people from different cultural groups interacting, which to me, and I've argued this for 30 years, is the center of what we should be studying. It's very important to study actual behaviors within bona fide groups. Real people in the groups they normally would be in, because they act differently when you simply put them into a room for your research. Jointly constructed social events like rituals are terribly important and need to be studied much more. It's productive to study not just language, which in the US 99% of the work is still focusing on language, but it's important to look at nonverbal behavior and material culture, and that's why I picked those particular examples. Many of the other chapters do focus on language. And ethnography seems to me a particularly obvious choice for studying intercultural interactions. It's still not very common. And important to study micro examples in order to understand macro issues. It's very hard to study something large. If you want to study socialization, that's a very big fuzzy thing. You want to study cultural identity, what on earth do you study? So you look at very little things when you study a big thing. That's how you do it. In terms of social construction theory, I already knew that identity is one of the key concepts in social construction literature. It would be very appropriate for intercultural communication scholars to use social construction theory when they study identity, and they don't, which is fascinating to me. I'm one of the people arguing for that. It would be nice. So I hope you start seeing how these different things fit together. To me, this is all the pieces that make sense as one puzzle put together. But for many other people, they're very different. Since identity is invisible, you can look at how it's displayed through visible symbols like objects or sets of symbols as they appear in rituals. And symbols, like other social constructions, because they're learned by children, can easily be analyzed by researchers. And again, people who are looking at social construction theory never look at children. I don't know why. Semiotic theory, okay, obviously symbols are central elements in meaning construction. Everybody who uses semiotic theory agrees with that. But that means that anytime you want to focus on meaning, you should be using semiotic theory, and that is not what happens. Semiotic theory is very rarely used within communication. The group is so small, in fact, that at the national level in the US, the group has now changed its name to Philosophy of Communication instead of Semiotics, because they weren't attracting enough people. There weren't enough people who even knew what it was, let alone studied it and said they wanted to be part of the group. Rituals are very useful if you use semiotic analysis, and they are very rarely studied, but that's where you combine many signs and sign systems. Symbols are polysemic. They have multiple meanings simultaneously displayed, and polysemy permits multiple meanings. Therefore, it increases complexity, and therefore it's much more interesting to study. Symbols that have multiple meanings. For some reason, that is very rarely to study, the thing that people pay attention to. And in terms of ethnography of communication, remember that the research question has to determine the method. You don't start by saying, I do ethnography. You start by saying, what do I want to know? I want to know how real people act. To me, that's my beginning point, not I was trained in ethnography. Genuine questions lead to new insights much faster than starting with a question when you know the answer. When the goal is to understand actual behavior of bona fide, legitimate cultural groups, ethnography is an obvious choice. It's not one method, but actually a set of methods, and it's very time-consuming, of course. But it's valuable because it leads to depth and complexity and understanding of complexity. So to me, it's worth the time that it takes. It is very difficult quite often when you're a graduate student or a new faculty member and you need to produce materials very quickly. That's a problem. I absolutely understand that. Personally, what I ended up doing was a lot of historical studies very quickly, which were much easier to produce, and got back to the ethnography later. Now, we are out of time, so I leave it to you whether you want to talk about the ways in which your parents socialized you and what you thought about that you didn't think about at the beginning, or whether you just want to ask me questions and talk about some of the content of this. Okay, and I'm sorry, I ran over much more than I meant to.
Thank you very much.